So good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the release of our Reproductive Rights Index. It's a part of our Status of Women in the States initiative here at IWPR. I'm Nicole Mason. I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Before we get started, and before I introduce our panel, I want to offer up a bit of framing and highlights from our Reproductive Rights Index. The most recent Supreme Court decision has sent many of us reeling and has provoked questions not only about the future of the women's reproductive health and bodily autonomy, but the movement as well. In the context of my work, specifically policy, I've been thinking a lot about how we got to this moment and what strategies might move us forward. And that might be compelling in this moment as we work collectively to strengthen reproductive health care access for women and people across the country. Truthfully, by the time Dobbs had reached the Supreme Court, it was already too late. The tilting of the Supreme Court in recent years only partially explains the loss. The historic lack of investments in state-level infrastructure, especially in historically hostile states, to women's rights and to access to abortion, is in part to blame for Roe being overturned. The strategy employed by anti-abortion advocates to chip away at abortion access in the states by proposing and passing restrictive laws was not a secret. Between January 1st, 2011 and July 21st, 2019, states enacted 483 new abortion restrictions, accounting for nearly 40% of all abortion restrictions enacted by states in the decades since Roe versus Wade. In the last 30 years in Mississippi, the state had passed a series of regulations such as requiring multiple appointments and waiting periods for an abortion, as well as rigid guidelines for clinics that has led to the shutdown of all of its abortion clinics except for one. Once a restrictive piece of legislation winds itself through a conservative legislature in a state like Mississippi, it's more than likely to pass and to be signed into law if the governor of the state is conservative. If this legislation is challenged, it will more than likely be upheld by conservative courts in that very same state. In the state of Mississippi, there are close to a dozen established or ad hoc anti-abortion groups in the state, as well as outside resources poured into the state to advance restrictive legislation, including the Dobbs case. For anti-abortion proponents, Mississippi is a model state, an ideal testing ground for restrictive laws and legislation. In the absence of a state-based infrastructure, a solid offensive and defensive strategy, and willingness to do head-to-head battle in hostile states such as Mississippi, Dobbs made its way to the Supreme Courts. Once there, and with the conservative majority on the bench, the overturning of Roe versus Wade was indeed nearly inevitable. The question is now what? What should we all be thinking about as we move forward in our work? I'm hoping we'll be able to answer some of those questions and hear from some really great experts in the field in our time together. Next, I wanted to share a few highlights from our Reproductive Rights Index in our research. Last year, IWPR conducted research estimating the economic cost of abortion restrictions on workers and state economies. We found that abortion restrictions cost workers and women $105 billion a year. When we look at our Reproductive Rights Index, in the bottom 5 ranked states, the economic loss of abortion restrictions is approximately $8.5 billion, ranging from $5.3 billion in Missouri to $362 million in South Dakota. In terms of our rankings, the top ranked state for women's reproductive rights is New Jersey. California ranks second, followed by Washington, Oregon, and Connecticut. It's important to note that all 5 of the top ranked states for women's reproductive rights have also codified the right to abortion in state law. The worst ranked states for women's reproductive rights is Missouri, ranking 51st in the index, followed by Idaho, Nebraska, Arkansas, and South Dakota. Access in states to the full range of reproductive health care services, including abortion, is also linked to other indicators of well-being and progress for women. States that limit women's reproductive rights and access to reproductive health care services also rank lower last on other indicators of women's well-being, such as employment and earnings, political participation, and educational attainment and opportunity, among others. These states are also more likely to lack strong family policies such as family or paid medical leave. For example, in the lowest ranked states for women's reproductive rights, the average median income for women is $24,335 compared to $29,251 in the top 5 states. The median income for women in Missouri, the worst ranked state in the index, is about $25,000 compared to $31,000 for women in New Jersey, the top ranked state in the index. Women residing in the highest ranked states for reproductive rights were also more likely to have higher levels of educational attainment than women in lower ranked states. What all of this tells me is that in addition to a federal strategy, we need a 50-state strategy that not only aims to protect and expand women's reproductive freedom and autonomy, but also women's economic security and well-being as well. With that, I'd like to introduce our panel. We have with us today Christine Clark, who is a former program officer at the Hewlett Foundation and has worked alongside many of us for more than 2 decades. She's an expert in reproductive rights funding and programming. And then we have Candace Gibson, who's the Director of Government Relations at the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice, an old organization that I've worked with since I was in my 20s. So I'm so happy to have you here, Candace. And then we have Jessica Pickney-Gill. She's the Executive Director of Access Reproductive Justice and has done tremendous work at the state level on abortion access. And I heard has been about on a number of webinars talking about this very same thing over the last few weeks. And then we also have, lastly, John Boyd. He's the principal of the Boyd Company, a well-known corporate selection site. And he'll talk a little bit about what this means for businesses who are, and the impact that these abortion restrictions and the Dobbs decision will have on businesses in states. So first I'll turn to Christine. Christine, I would love to get your perspective on how the Dobbs decision has or will impact women's reproductive rights in the states and at the federal level, especially given your perspective as a funder.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you for including me in this. It's great to be here. So I left the Hewlett Foundation about a month ago. So I'm not an active funder anymore, but I did that for 8 years. And so one of the nice things about being in philanthropy is you get a bit of a bird's eye view of what's happening. And I'll just touch on a couple points related to philanthropy right now, and then one more general comment. So in terms of, I think what philanthropy is thinking about, and probably everybody is thinking about, which Nicole touched on, is a need to, sort of to balance. We're all in a position now of having to balance mitigating the harm that's being done and trying to kind of respond in, the quickest, most effective way possible to essentially move resources as close to where people need access to abortion, and as close to the front lines as possible, which for some philanthropic institutions, including the Hewlett Foundation, was not sort of a big part of our funding before, just given budget size and where we focused and things like that. But there's a real churn, I think, happening where people are having to figure out very quickly, certain types of funders very quickly, how to respond. And I think it's not just funders. I think it's everybody is sort of having to balance, the long-term kind of vision work with this like very immediate need. That's one thing. And then the other thing, to Nicole's point, and I think actually the index that has just come out is hugely valuable right now, is looking at kind of a 50-state strategy. And that's going to take a while to figure out what that is. It's going to take advocates on the ground to really drive that process. But one of the things that I think is really helpful about the index actually is that it pulls together. Hewlett has been a longtime funder of IWPR, and particularly since Nicole came on board a few years ago, we've really invested in the work to connect reproductive health with economic opportunity, with other aspects of women's well-being. And I think it's in the states actually where those connections can be kind of made most clearly and most compellingly. It may not feel like there's an audience in every state, and there are advocates in every state who've been fighting for this for these things for years. But having that kind of on the ground data is super, super important for people on the ground to be able to use, to connect the dots, and to really kind of start changing the conversation from, a lot of us have been doing this, but really sort of, I think, pursuing this path of I don't know exactly what the language is, but really kind of pushing this point about what is pro-life, like what does that actually mean? Like, anti-abortion folks are in these states, like you can see from the index that it's not pro-life necessarily, that the states that are supposedly the most pro-life are not in the way that people are actually experiencing healthcare, access to education, all of these things. So I think really connecting those dots state by state is super critical. I live in California. It's a completely different world in California. Our governor immediately, as soon as this decision, actually before the decision even came down, was, expanding access even for people outside of California. So I think those, from a philanthropic perspective, I think when I was in these conversations a month ago, the focus was really on kind of balancing immediate mitigation of harm with like drilling down in states and starting to think about that as a strategy. I will say one more thing, just generally, this is, doesn't really have much to do with philanthropy, but I think just having watched this field and been part of it for so long and kind of seeing what's happening right now within the movement is, I hope that collective we can not sort of let perfect be the enemy of the good. I think people should follow their instincts, step up and lead. I think there's a lot of fear internally of how other people within the movement might perceive certain things, and I see it happening, and it's I don't think it has to be like that, even though it might be hard to be the one that's pushing forward. So those are just my immediate thoughts.
Thanks, Christine. And you raise a couple of really good points. One is about narrative change and framing around thinking about like, what is pro-life? Like, what does this mean? Or what does it look like? And how we challenge that when we're thinking about like, what does it really mean for people to be thriving on all these indicators and doing well? And so really thinking about the language and the shifts in the narratives. And also, how do we just put ourselves out there and start doing something? And the point that you make about the perfect not being the enemy of the good, and just leaving space for new ideas and thinking around how we move forward with this work. So with that, I want to turn to Candace. Again, like I said, I'm old school, so I remember working alongside Sylvia many years ago at the Latina Institute. So you guys have been on the ground and in states like Texas for some time. So I would love to get your perspective and your thinking on, where we are and what we should be doing and thinking.
All right, thank you, Nicole, for having me on this conversation. I've worked with Kate Ryan, one of my colleagues, for many years, so I'm very excited to be in this space with you all and having this conversation. So for some of those who are new to Latina Institute, the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice centers Latina and Latinx voices to change the narrative and transform systems that the Latina and Latinx community are up against. So we try to build an activist space, shape policy, and shift culture to fuel a larger reproductive justice movement. And as Nicole has said, we're working in states like Texas, Florida, Virginia, and New York. For us, with the Dobbs decision, right, Roe was only the floor for our communities, right? While Roe versus Wade did initiate a new chapter in equity, I think, for many of our communities. It did not guarantee access to abortion care for our communities. And soon after Roe, you had anti-abortion legislators roll out the Hyde Amendment, which blocks Medicaid from providing federal funds to cover abortion care. And the Medicaid program, is vitally important for many people of color to access health care. So when the Dobbs decision came down, we just knew that this would harm our communities the most, right? But we were not surprised. And I think historically, we have seen that the courts have never worked for all of our communities. And so, we continue to build power at the state and at the federal level, and also holding our elected officials accountable so that everyone in our communities can access the abortion care that they need. And I think, speaking to sort of what Christine said a couple of seconds ago, I think there's this time for proactive policy work, both at the federal and state level, and also, this need for culture shift work, right? I think we need to continue destigmatizing abortion care in this country, right? And recognize it as part of the full spectrum of healthcare in this country. I think the stigmatization of it has led us to this moment, right? And at the same time as well, thinking through how we educate our communities so that they have all the knowledge and information that they need to be able to step into their power, to hold their elected officials accountable, and also to actually meet the real needs of accessing care at the moment, right? Because from what I'm hearing from my state colleagues on the ground is folks are very confused at the moment about what they can access in these states, right? And there's also massive disinformation happening on social media as well. I'm not an expert to that point, but I think those are other concerns that we need to consider in this conversation.
Thanks, Candace. And again, we have so much work to do, and a lot of it is these narrative shifts, the cultural work, destigmatizing abortion care, and making sure that it's included when we think about and talk about the full range of reproductive health access for women and people. And so I just wanted to hear from you, Jessica. What are you thinking? What are you hearing? I know, like you said, you've been in the trenches for the last few weeks and talking about this, but just really curious about what you have to say.
Sure, thank you. Very happy to be here with you all today. As was mentioned, my name is Jessica Pinckney. I use she and her pronouns. I'm the executive director at Access Reproductive Justice, which is California's only statewide abortion fund. And there are a few things I wanted to highlight this morning or this afternoon for folks on the East Coast. And that is really the ecosystem that is the abortion access landscape. I think, when people think about the Dobbs decision, there's really this notion that we're turning rights back to the states, so to speak. But the way this works is that if folks can't get abortion in the state where they live, which they should be able to do because abortion is a human right, then they travel to a neighboring state where they can access care. So decisions made in Texas, in Oklahoma, in Louisiana, Arizona impact those of us in California. And the decisions we make here in California very directly impact those in our neighboring states as well. So as Christine had started to touch on, late last year, probably September or so, Governor Gavin Newsom approached advocates in California, abortion access advocates in California, as SB 8 was being enacted in Texas, and as we anticipated the Supreme Court hearing oral arguments in Dobbs v. Jackson. And he asked us to bring a council of folks together, researchers, academics, providers, patients, activists, anyone involved in making abortion accessible in California, to make a series of recommendations to him, his administration, and the state legislature. So Access Reproductive Justice, along with 5 of our amazing partners in California, formed a steering committee for the Future of Abortion Council and began holding a series of working groups to address many of the issues that we knew either already existed here in the state or would become issues as access eroded across the country. And in the course of about 2 months, we were able to put together about 45 recommendations to the governor and the legislature. And the highest priority recommendations were turned into legislation earlier this year by the California Legislative Women's Caucus. And since their initial introduction of those bills in January, there's also been an addition of 3 more. So there are about 16 bills moving through the legislature right now, ranging from improving the provider workforce and making sure it's a diverse workforce that can meet the needs of many patients, to ensuring that there is both procedural funding to cover the cost of people's abortions, as well as practical support funding to cover travel, lodging, transportation, food, childcare, lost wages, etc. There are a number of bills related to legal protections, ensuring that patients, providers, and those supporting patients and providers are safe from prosecution for doing their jobs in many instances. And there is also legislation around ensuring that we have strong community education throughout the state, that we're combating the misinformation that crisis pregnancy centers often provide folks, and ensure that our education is really rooted in the communities that we serve. And luckily, the governor did just pass his budget at the end of June, which included $200 million for many of the recommendations and asks that we as a state have made to the governor and the legislature. And the bills continue to move through the process, with hopes of many of them passing here towards the end of the summer and early fall. And I say all this to say that California is really trying to do what we know we need to do, because other governments have failed their communities, and the Supreme Court has failed us as a whole. But we know that these solutions will both benefit Californians as well as those who may come to California from other states to access care. And we also know that this is not a permanent fix. People deserve to access care in their homes, in their communities, in their states. And so California is merely working to meet a need in this moment, but certainly recognizes that there's still work to be done in other states and at the federal level to ensure abortion access as a right that folks can obtain, free from criminalization, free from judgment, and in their homes and in their communities. So while we're simultaneously working on our Future of Abortion Council priorities and recommendations, we're also working fervently to make it clear that it's not fair that people have to travel great distances to access the care that they need, and that there are huge economic burdens put on predominantly low income, Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ communities, immigrant communities, young folks. And so I think it's just really important to think about our country as a whole and the abortion landscape as a whole when we have these conversations, and understand that, while many states are doing the work to provide abortion access and care to those in hostile states, we also recognize that it's not a permanent solution, and it's not necessarily the fair or right solution. But to Christine's point, we're doing what we can in this moment to meet the moment, and we'll continue to adjust and adapt, as well as fight to make sure that people have the rights that they deserve.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks for outlining some of the good work that's happening in California. I remember before the Dobbs case came down, California, like you said, was already strategizing about what should be done, what kind of legislation might we have in place or might be put in place. But I think, I want to circle back around to thinking about the burden it places on these states like California for women to have to travel to be able to access services. So John, I want to turn to you last but not least to talk about the businesses and what this means for businesses who are located in states that are, hostile to abortion access or have restricted abortion access. Like I said at the top, IWPR did a recent study before even the Texas ban. We found $105 billion cost to women workers and state economies in terms of abortion restrictions. And we know that cost has risen exponentially because of the ban. So could you talk a little bit about what this means for businesses and also workers?
Sure. We're already seeing blue state governors in states like California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut actively target developers and site-seeking companies and using the Dobbs decision really as an opening wedge to form a relationship with that company and talk about some other business climate assets that state enjoys. And even with companies that would prefer to avoid the issue altogether or deal with this issue behind closed doors through lobbying or supporting candidates with similar values, these governors are making or by obviously expanding healthcare benefits to include out-of-state abortion. These blue state governors are making this a business case also. It's important to remember that businesses are only as good as their people. And we know that by huge margins, okay? Workers prefer to live and work in states with legal abortion, particularly younger workers, millennials and Generation Z, which are highly coveted sectors of the US labor force today. I think it's also important to remember a lot of the high growth markets in the Sun Belt, markets like Phoenix and Dallas, and Austin, Nashville, Miami, Atlanta. These are markets that have attracted industry because of not just low taxes and low operating costs and pro-business regulatory policies, but also because of the in-migration of tech talent, of young workers from cities like San Francisco and Chicago and New York. Anything to slow that pace of young workers will be a challenge to the development community. I think lawmakers are very cognizant, or should be cognizant, of the economic repercussions that North Carolina experienced several years ago with their very controversial bathroom bill. It's estimated that North Carolina lost roughly $4 billion of canceled projects, canceled tourism, canceled conventions, high profile planned expansions and relocations by companies like PayPal and Deutsche Bank and Adidas did not happen because of the bathroom bill. North Carolina lost the NCAA tournament. It lost the NBA All-Star game because of the bathroom bill. It lost high-profile concerts and conventions. So the other part of that, okay, it's easy to look at a precedent move like a planned expansion by a PayPal or a Deutsche Bank that did not happen. But what's impossible to calculate are what I call opportunity costs, okay? And it's important to remember that site selection really is a process of elimination. So it's impossible to know how many site-seeking companies or developers or convention planners or even high-ticket celebrity performers decided not to do a project or a show or a convention in a state. That's a warning really to some of these states that are planning to outlaw abortion in the wake of the controversial Dobbs decision.
So thank you, John, for saying that. And when I think about our work as a movement, as communities, really being able to talk across communities of practice, to the business community, and really think broadly about the impact of abortion restrictions is going to be really, really important to our work around this. And I just want to talk about, and this is to everyone, just what does this mean? So we've talked about, Jessica, what California is doing, and then we've talked about some of the other, states, what's happening in states, but what might we be thinking about for states that are not California and for states where, there is no abortion access or that things are changed? What kind of strategies should we be thinking about in those states that don't have friendly legislatures or governors? What might we be thinking there?
So one thing I would say is that I have been trying to take the words of our colleague Kwajalein Jackson in Georgia out of her mouth as often as possible, and remind folks that just as it took years and decades to dismantle Roe v. Wade, it will take significant time to rebuild. And thinking about clinics, particularly clinics and abortion funds in hostile states, it is not easy to open a clinic in those states, nor is it easy to shut a clinic down. There are a number of people who work in these clinic settings who often look very much like the very people who are receiving abortions. And they are at risk of losing their jobs if they haven't already. And so thinking about what we can do in hostile states to continue to support clinics who not only provide abortion, but also provide contraceptive care, who provide STI testing, who provide a number of reproductive health care services for the community, who are trusted community members where patients are often comfortable receiving the support and care that they need. I think we just really need to be thinking through what we can do in this moment to help those clinics stay open and stay whole, and ensure that the staffs are being supported and protected in this moment. Because honestly, you know, in some of these states where there's only 1 or 2 clinics, if they shut down, it takes years to rebuild and reopen. It cannot necessarily happen overnight. And I think that that's not something that we're always thinking about when we think about how quickly the climate can change in this country. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that regard, as well as just promoting abortion access and people's human rights more broadly.
Thank you. Did anybody else want to answer that? Or
I was going to chime
in,
Nicole, if I can, because
yes, thanks, Candace.
I love Jessica's remarks. So I would also say, you know, with this, so, you know, speaking to the states like, you know, Texas, Florida, right, and even Virginia, which has a change in the governorship, right. You know, for Texas and Florida, right, part of that work too is looking through at what can be advanced at the local level. Right, you know, Austin a couple of years ago did create with local funds, you know, ancillary support for people seeking abortion care that would, you know, that would cover travel, lodging, et cetera. Now that ended up being litigated, right? But I think that's also an opportunity for coalition building, right, and to pursue a proactive strategy as well. I think in places like Virginia, as I mentioned, right, it's also just using this window of opportunity before there's a 15-week ban being introduced to craft and implement policies that can fortify Virginia potentially as a haven for reproductive health care as to the extent that it can. And then I think, you know, too, also speaking to what's happening in New York as well is, you know, even though New York is considered a very progressive state, right, there, you know, many communities struggle with accessing healthcare, right, and also there's now the question again about misinformation, right, and individuals going to crisis pregnancy centers that don't provide the information needed for individuals to actually make the best decisions for themselves when it comes to accessing abortion care. And I'll say too, at the federal level, right, I think there is an opportunity, at least at our organization, you know, we've been advocating for the elimination of the filibuster in order to advance bills like the Women's Health Protection Act in the Senate, right? Because you know, still at the end of the day, there's a role for the federal government, even though there are dynamics within the Senate that are harmful, right? That can provide the federal floor at least needed to ensure, you know, that people's rights are protected and to ensure access. And so we still have to keep building those proactive fights at the federal level as well.
Thank you for saying that, because I do think it's a both and strategy. So looking at the federal level, but also in the states. And I also want to also shout out a local strategy, like you're talking about, like in Austin, Texas. Like it's very, so I think thinking creatively about like every tool that we can leverage, every strategy we can leverage at the federal and local level to make access easier for women. So, I want to talk a little bit about something that you said, Christine, that I think people are asking for clarification on about, and it's related to strategy about perfect not being the enemy of the good. And, for those of us who've worked in the women's movement, but in the reproductive rights movement, trying to come up with a perfect strategy that's all encompassing, that meets everyone's needs, could hurt. And so I just wondered if you might be able to speak to that, or anyone have something to say about that and thinking about the strategy moving forward.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, I think it's a great question. And actually, one of the responses in there, the anonymous response, I think is a really, really good example of, kind of, I've just observed, and I think we probably all have seen this, that there's just a sort of a fear of, saying not exactly the right thing. But I think it's problematic. And I mean, I have done this too over many, many years, had this idea that if we just say just the right thing, or don't say this particular thing because it's going to set off the other side, that will somehow advance our cause. And I think, we're at the end, like we've gotten to the point where, Roe as the ceiling is over for now. And so I just don't think that really worrying about like exactly what we're going to say and not speaking from the heart is the way that we should go forward. So the example in there, I think, is a perfect example of people probably being afraid to really speak from the heart and talk about how they feel about these things. So it's more, it's just to the extent that we can. And I think as terrible as it is, this is a moment where we can, it's like sort of opened up this world for us. If we can say what we believe, and let's speak from the heart, and let's actually talk about these issues, not just in strategy ways and talking points, but in how we actually feel about them.
And so I don't want to bring anybody into this conversation who maybe shouldn't be here, but Carol Tobias from the National Right to Life said, after the ruling, she said, today begins the new anti-abortion movement, or the pro-life movement. Today is a new day, which I took to mean that they're thinking about the strategy in a different way since the falling of Roe. And I think in that this moment affords this same opportunity for our work to think differently about how we think and strategize about the work, have some of these conversations about feelings and how, the rhetoric and the narrative. And so, I'm hoping that we can also see this as, a new moment or a flashpoint in our work and in our movement, if that makes sense. There's another question around, well, can we just stick to the narrative piece a little bit? Because I know that, Christine, you've done some research recently. Oh my God, ding, ding, let me just close this here. So you've done some research recently, and you held, before you were leaving Hewlett, a really great webinar about narrative change and how we think and talk about this work. Candace talking about what's happening with people on the ground, the misinformation, the disinformation. So how might we as a movement and in our work start thinking about some of the narrative change and some of the, countering some of that disinformation at the state level and even at the local level as we try to build a base for this work, broaden our base, or think about mobilizing the base?
I wonder if somebody else wants to take a stab at that, since I just answered. I mean, I can, but I'm sure there are other people that have thoughts too. And also, it was just brought to my attention that the audience can't see the Q&A. So sorry about that.
Okay. It's just us. Okay.
Yeah.
Candace, how about you? Because you talked about disinformation and what's happening in the state, on the ground in Texas.
Yeah. So, to this point, right? I think particularly in Texas, right? We saw what was going to happen before the Dobbs decision came down with the implementation of the SB 8 law in Texas, right? Which because it has that vigilante mechanism where individuals can harass pretty much anyone who is trying to help somebody get an abortion in the state of Texas, right? That causes a chilling effect of how people can help their neighbors or help anyone that they love seeking abortion care. So a lot of, and that I think has ramped up, right, because of the Dobbs decision as states continue to ban abortion care at various points in time. So part of this piece is just ensuring that in my thinking, that the communities that have already built networks like abortion funds, right, our activists on the ground, as well as our field staff, have already built the network of sharing information to our communities of what's available to them and breaking down these concepts of what care they can receive. So I think there needs to be, as always, robust investment within abortion funds, within these, networks that are already set up to get folks to the care that they need. I think that's a part of the conversation here, as well as this narrative shift that we're thinking through. And then I also think too, right, is these laws on the books, right, whether at the local, state, or federal level, right, they're for the person who is working multiple jobs, right, and who has to make so many decisions about their day in order to feed their families or to access the care that they need, right? We really need to break down this information in accessible ways, and I think individuals will go to the folks who are trusted messengers within their communities. So I think it's continuing to have information that's out there, that's accessible, that's in different formats. For example, we at Latina Institute are providing a lot of information on Instagram, right? Just because that is a platform that our constituency is going to for information. And another piece here as well is, we know once we provide this education that our community will actually be very supportive of efforts and be supportive of abortion care. In 2018, we did some polling and it showed that 9 in 10 Latinas and Latinxes would support someone who would support a loved one who needed an abortion. And there's also more recent polling that we did with our partners at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, as well as in our own voice, the National Black Reproductive Justice Agenda, that show overwhelmingly that women of color want policymakers to support reproductive health care, including abortion care. So I think that's part of it too, is especially for communities of color and including the Latinx community, right? There's a lot of myths, right, about what the Latinx or Latina community supports, right? And so the education is just critical to highlight that, these communities overwhelmingly support abortion care.
So let me just tell you something about this Q&A chat. It's on fire. So there's so many different directions we can go to. And I think even talking about the stigmatization of abortion care and access, and some of the things that you just brought up, Candace, around beliefs about what communities support and do not support is also really important. So I'm going to try to bring all of this together. But before I do that, I just wanted to bring John into the conversation. People have been asking about, and we've all seen the conversations about, the stigma in the workplace regarding abortion and how it affects, how it might affect women, and disclosure and, all of these things, especially as women. For some companies who are pledging support, you would have to disclose that you need to access care in order for them to cover the cost of care, which goes into some privacy issues in my thinking around this. And then John, you also mentioned that some companies and businesses are choosing a backdoor strategy where they are lobbying, quietly, and some are being more public about their decisions. Could you talk about those two different strategies and why it might be important for businesses to be more vocal in terms of their support or opposition around some of these abortion restrictions, and especially in states that are have outlawed abortion?
Sure, and one of the reasons that I believe that it's still too early to tell, okay, the true impact this will have on site selection decisions is because of just how fresh and new all of this is. I think a lot of companies are taking a wait and see approach at the moment, but I do expect companies that view social impact as critical to their corporate brand, critical to their recruiting strategies. I expect those companies really in the months ahead to be more vocal and to talk about reproductive rights as a critical, fundamental business climate factor. And I think, one strategy really here is to, when we start seeing relocations associated with this issue or expansions associated with this issue, interview these CEOs, and publicize these findings to lawmakers, to the media, to other influential members of the business community. I think polling is another great strategy. Okay, continue to poll consumers and employees on how important reproductive rights are. I think the latest polling suggests that 60% of people want legal abortion in all or most cases. I mean, these findings need to be constantly publicized and promoted to leading decision makers. And clearly, there's also a major role for philanthropy. Okay, to help. We talk about what initiatives at the local level, but helping smaller companies that don't have the resources to help their employees travel out of state for an abortion. That obviously elevates the need and the role of philanthropy. And if I could just introduce one other topic here that I think is interesting, another economic impact here is medical tourism. Okay, we see medical tourism really having a role here. I'm joining you today from New Jersey. Our governor, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, recently passed legislation to protect healthcare providers that are going to do abortions on out-of-state people coming in for an abortion. That will really, I expect legislation in a lot of blue states to really accelerate existing medical tourism efforts.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm one to say that, we are where we are right now in terms of thinking about, we have different states doing different things where, some states have access and some are really restrictive. And so I want to talk a little bit about what might a 50-state strategy look like if we were going to, be thinking about the work ahead of us. And, how might we resource this in terms of our thinking about this, the future of this work. Someone asked a question about what might a 50-state strategy look like, and so I wanted to, maybe Jessica, you can start us off. Sorry, I've been thinking about this, so I'm sure you have to.
Yeah, I definitely have. I don't know that I have an answer. I think it's a complicated question. I think what we're seeing in this moment is a lot of proactive or receiving states really trying to work collaboratively. The day the Dobbs decision came out, the governors in California, Oregon, and Washington announced kind of like a West Coast trifecta. And so I think that there is certainly collaboration that can occur across all 50 states. And I think it really requires connectivity and communication. there have been many conversations for many years about how if Roe were to fall, how we would get folks from one location to another. I think abortion funds are a really interesting example of how that works and how that has worked for many years and decades, and could provide interesting insight into how we can better collaborate across states that are both hostile or more receptive to abortion access. I think it requires pretty significant investment, not only from all 50 states, but also from philanthropy to really make it cohesive and something that's feasible for organizations and advocates of varying sizes and capacity. But yeah, I don't know that I fully have the answer to this one worked out yet. I think it's something we need, but I would love to hear from you, Nicole, also what you've been thinking about.
Christine, did you want to jump in here, or maybe Candace? I mean, I do have something to say, but.
So the resource question?
The resource of the 50-state strategy. Somebody said, 50-state strategy, and why is that better, or
what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I can say what I was referencing was more from my experience at the Hewlett Foundation, where I was sort of in a cohort of funders that mostly fund at the federal level and don't give a lot at the state level. So that was more what I was referencing. But I mean, I think I agree with Jessica. It's tricky. It's like everything is moving so quickly, trying to figure out, in terms of my point about mitigating the harms, it's like give to funds on the ground, which ones, where, and then something changes there, a bunch of funds have to shut down. So then moving over there, so I think one of the biggest issues with the funding community, and I hope that this changes, is just the nimbleness or the lack of nimbleness. And I think a lot of these funders need to start moving more quickly and figure out mechanisms to do that. A lot of foundations in particular, which is what I'm most familiar with, just don't move very fast. And I think they're going to have to, and, really listen to the ground. And also, I think, Jessica, to your point too, about, people in different states really working together. I think the extent to which, I think that's what really needs to drive resources. And it's hard because you don't always know where the potential funding is, but to the extent that people on the ground can, get to the funders and propose, like, this is what we need to be doing. There is so much money. I mean, there's philanthropic money, but there's also just like so much new money coming into the space. So maybe it's also creating mechanisms to find ways to connect people on the ground with that funding. Because I mean, I have, just having been at the Hewlett Foundation, people like rich people were just reaching out and basically saying, like, who should we give money to? So to the extent that people on the ground with all their spare time can actually have something at the ready, I think there's definitely a lot of interest. That's for sure, in resourcing this work.
And thanks, Christine, for saying that in terms of like having the ideas and the strategy and sort of getting people activated. So when I think about a 50-state strategy, I do think we need work at the federal level, and like I said, at the state and local levels, but I really think strengthening state infrastructures, especially in states that are hostile, is really critical in this moment. And we can just use Mississippi as a case study. There were significant amount of dollars poured into on the other side, around this legislation, Dobbs and other pieces of legislation over a sustained period of time. And while there are really very solid reproductive justice organizations in Mississippi, we have to be very clear, and I'm just going to say it, that they were sorely and very under-resourced and underfunded. So to think that in a state that's hostile in the way that Mississippi has been hostile to women's reproductive rights, without equipping the organizations on the ground with the resources to fight back in a very sustained way, is just we see. we see where we are. And so I really do think that as we think about the work moving forward, really thinking about a model that not only I think, federal support is really very critical, but in states where we know that, that are really hostile to women's reproductive rights, we really need to support those leaders and strengthen that state infrastructure and not be afraid, in my opinion, of the fights and the battles. I worked at Maryland NARAL when I was in college, and it was a good time, because it was Maryland. But it's much harder to do this work in states that are hostile, like Mississippi and Texas. And so thinking through what that work might look like in the future, and that I think it's both offensive and defensive. And not shying away from those fights in the states that are hostile to people like us. I mean, I think it's hard to go into these hostile states and do this work. But what might it look like to build that infrastructure once and for all in this moment? I think is a really important question for all of us interested in this work. So that's what I got to say about it.
Nicole, I was just going to add one point there to what you said, and because it was like +1 on everything you said, and I think as we continue to develop the state strategy or the federal strategy, right, it's not just about the resourcing of these reproductive justice organizations that are predominantly led by Black women, by communities of color, right? It's also how we center their leadership and the voices of their constituencies in all of these efforts, right? And to trust them to lead us in the solution that we have to pave out at these various levels and create. I think, for decades, we have, seen their leadership, as you have said, right? Like either under-resourced or maligned or not even brought into these conversations, right? And that has led us, unfortunately, to this moment. So I truly think that we have to continue to center that leadership and honor, what the decisions that they think are best to make, right, and to help support them in those strategies and the policy choices that we try to work on.
And I have to say, we have about 3 minutes left. I think that's, in terms of thinking about the future of this work and what we might need to do, I think this is part of the work. In this next chapter, as we think about how we might move forward, both a sustained larger strategy, 50-state strategy, but also resourcing the people in those states who are doing the work, and women, and centering their leadership and trusting them to lead on the strategy, but also importantly, I think more conversation between what's happening at the federal level and state level, and making sure that there's that communication goes both ways in this work is also going to be critically important. But as an end, I would like to give you all the last word. Something, this is, I don't know about you, but this moment has felt very hard. And so I want to end on a note that's a little bit more hopeful. So if you can, something that's happened that you feel really hopeful about, or what you've seen over the last couple of weeks that gives you hope that we can right this ship and expand reproductive access for women across the states, would be really great. So we feeling a little bit energized. Who wants to start?
Well, I'll add something. And first, Dr. Mason, thank you for inviting me and moderating this excellent panel. Here's a positive here. I think this is a time of unprecedented mobility. Because of remote working, people can live and work virtually anywhere that they want to do so. Okay, so remembering that businesses are only as good as their people. That's so key. Or even companies that are growing weary of ESG or woke culture, or instinctively want to avoid the issue, and are more concerned about current economic challenges. Even these companies, as they realize that this will be a fundamental HR factor, and all of the hidden costs associated with this new HR recruiting and retention issue, these companies will be motivated to be more vocal and really get engaged on this issue. So there's a bottom line motivation here, aside from any type of ESG or social impact that will, I expect it to dictate corporate behavior and corporate site selection decisions in the months and years ahead.
Thanks, John. Thanks.
I will say the governor moved $200 million towards abortion access in California, and is well aware that we will probably be asking for more money in the coming months and years, as we anticipate an influx of folks coming to California. So while I said earlier, and I mean it, it's not fair that people have to travel long distances to access the care they need. I personally am very grateful that there are receiving states like California that are trying to provide safety and security, not only for our citizens, but for folks anywhere throughout the country who need support and care. So trying to hold on to that as much as possible in these fairly dark days.
I'll quickly add that I think what's giving me hope is that many individuals with the overturn of Roe are coming into this movement. They're coming into this movement with intentions of wanting to do something, right, and understand the work that has been created has been done for decades. And I think also I think folks are waking up and realizing that the same anti-abortion legislators who were denying abortion care are also the same legislators who are trying to keep wages low, and who are the same legislators who are denying voting rights, right? And so there's a great moment of righteous anger, right? And so how is it that we keep welcoming these individuals within the movement, and help them, give them the tools so that they can hold their elected officials accountable?
Yeah, I'll close with something related to the narrative shift conversation, which is that there are people out there, and always have been, who are, speaking really, really bravely about this and talking about abortion in ways that are really brave. Not just, they would be kind of in any context, but particularly some of them in very hostile states. And one of them is Cherise Scott with Sister Reach in Memphis, Tennessee. And she talks about abortion as an act of love. And I just about started crying when I talked to her about this the first time, because what she means by that, it really resonates with me. Like most people, many people who have abortions are doing it from a place of love. And it sounds crazy. Years ago, I remember talking to, like a sort of inside the Beltway communications expert, something similar. I don't have, I'm not as eloquent as Cherise, but something along those lines of we have to talk about why people actually make these decisions for their own families and what their motivations are in many cases. And the person, this comms expert, was like, don't ever say that. Never say anything like that. You can't talk about the children you already have. You can't talk about any of those things. Has to be focused on policy. And I just could not disagree with that more. And I think we've lost an opportunity by not talking about that, really speaking from the heart. And so the words are out there, the people are out there trying to kind of forge a path and opening up a new conversation. And I think this, like I said before, I think this just opens up, it's all open, it's out in the open now. We can talk about this the way we feel like we should talk about it.
So on that note, this has been a really amazing conversation. I am all about expanding the narrative. I'm all about thinking through new strategies and ways of engaging. I'm all about bringing in new communities of practice to really build on this work and what we know will be a big Herculean lift. Or I don't know if it's the next 10, 20, or 50 years, but we have a lot of work to do. So I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and sharing their beautiful insights and wisdom with us, and all of you who came and joined us. This is only the beginning of the conversation. I wish you could see the Q&A. Sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, but the conversation will continue. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.